Daniel Sports Center, we go over a college football game preview and prediction on the 2022 Pinstripe Bowl matchup between the Syracuse Orange and the Minnesota Golden Gophers. Both teams have had good seasons getting to this point. Syracuse, a team that started out the season 6-0, finished out 7-5. So they kind of disappointed down the stretch. You look back at this team in mid-October, they were looking like a potential dark horse contender in the ACC as they were 6-0 at one point. But down the stretch, this team dealt with a couple of injuries, and it's been a challenge for this team down the stretch for Syracuse. But they're looking to finish off the season strong as they take on Minnesota, a team that's generally had a good season. They did go on a little bit of a losing streak there in the middle part of the season, but overall, an 8-4 record, and this team played pretty well down the stretch. Should make for a good matchup. We'll be going over a full game preview and prediction on this matchup here today, starting with their team trend. Syracuse beat Boston College 32-23 to finish out the regular season. That was actually their one win in their previous 6 games, which was very surprising considering where this team was in mid-October. They were 6-0 at one point, looking like a really good football team, and in the end, they kind of disappointed down the stretch, but at least they beat Boston College to finish out the regular season. 7-5 is their record. Minnesota on the other side beat Wisconsin in Madison 23-16. Wisconsin really disappointed this season. Just kind of a rebuild season for the Badgers, but Minnesota was able to take advantage of that, and they got the win against their rival 23-16, and that puts them at 8-4 on the season. Minnesota's had an interesting season as well. I mean, if you look back to early October, this team was far and away the favorite in the Big Ten West, just based on the way they played in September. This team looked great in September. Every single game that they played, they were dominant. And once they got into October, they lost 3 straight to Purdue, Illinois, and Penn State. And that really put a big dent in their hopes of being a Big Ten contender. But down the stretch, this team has won 4 of their past 5. So overall, this team hasn't been terrible. Games beyond Thursday, December 29th in Bronx, New York. So this is kind of a home game for Syracuse. Syracuse, of course, being in New York. That is something to keep in mind here. Kickoff is 2 p.m. Eastern. Spread's going with Minnesota here by 10. So the Gophers are favored by a touchdown and a field goal in this matchup. Over-under is 42. And the FPI is going Minnesota as well, 61%. Series history, Minnesota leads at 3-2. But Syracuse did win the last matchup. That game was back in 2013. Stat comparison, Syracuse is 74th in points per game, 46th in points allowed. So defensively, this team has been generally good this season. On the offense, they're averaging 28 points a game. And then passers game, they're 74th as well. Rushers game, they're 98th. And then for yards allowed, 30th in passing, 74th in rushing. So a strong pass defense here in Syracuse, but they are going up against a Minnesota team that is especially strong in the rushing game. Mo Ibrahim has rushed for over 1,500 yards, nearly 1,600, and 19 touchdowns this season. He is definitely one of the best running backs in the country, and it's great to see him excelling with the Gophers. Last season, he got injured. I think he was in the first game of the season, and that was a huge blow for the Gophers in the first game to lose him. I think it was an Achilles tear. It was a really severe injury, and that's not easy to come back from, and Ibrahim has done really well considering that. So this is an offense that really relies on him. I mean, you've had Tanner Morgan as the quarterback for a good chunk of the season, but then Callie McManus took over halfway through the season, and he's been the starter for the previous 4 games or so for Minnesota, and he has started 5 games this season. So I mean, the quarterback situation, the passing game, not very strong for Minnesota. I mean, Tanner Morgan, if you remember back to when he was, you could say in his prime back in 2019, he was a great quarterback. He was a great passer all around. And so it's been really confusing seeing Tanner Morgan falling off as much as he has the past few years. He's really disappointed, but at least they got Ibrahim because he has really had a huge impact on this offense. And that's going to be a thing for Syracuse is containing him. I mean, if you can't contain Ibrahim, you're not going to beat the Gophers. But for Minnesota, they're a strong defensive team, 4th in the country in points allowed. They're allowing an average of 13 points a game. So whether that surprises you or not, Minnesota is a really strong team defensively, but on the offense, not quite as much. And that's kind of been the story of the Big Ten West this season. Several good defenses, but the offenses have been terrible in the Big Ten West this season. I mean, if you look at Iowa, just a terrible team on offense. Wisconsin's been terrible on offense. I mean, in your main 2 contenders, Purdue and Illinois. Illinois was probably the best team in the Big Ten West this season, even though Purdue ended up winning the division. I mean, Purdue and Illinois weren't terrible in offense, but defensively, both teams were at least decent. So you get the point. The Big Ten West, just a terrible division in general, but especially on the offensive side of the ball for every team, really. But yeah, I mean, for Minnesota, 15th in the country in rush yards a game, and then for passing defense, they're 8th, rushing defense 18th. So it's going to be tough to score a lot of points on Minnesota, that's for sure. Your recent matchups, Syracuse, they beat Boston College 32-23. And then there are those losses for Syracuse. They lost to Wake Forest 35-45. Got blown out to Florida State 38-3. They lost to Pitt on the road 19-9. Couldn't get anything going there. And they lost to Notre Dame 24-41. But you look back to the early parts of the season for Syracuse. I mean, this team, they were impressive in the first half of the season. They beat up Louisville. They beat a UConn team that got to a bowl game. Beat Purdue, who turned out to be the Big Ten West champion. They beat 15th ranked NC State 24-9. Then after that, I mean, they kept it close against Clemson, really put Clemson on upset alert. But then from there, it just fell off big for Syracuse. They lost 5 straight, and they broke that streak beating Boston College. But it's been an interesting season for Syracuse. That's for sure. This team, kind of the first half and the second half of the season were very much different from each other. But for Minnesota, they beat Wisconsin 23-16, lost Iowa 10-13, beat Northwestern 31-3, beat Nebraska 20-13, also shut out Rutgers 31-0. So this team has been impressive down the stretch. And once again, I'll say this, they were dominant in September. And there's a reason why this team was looking like the biggest, the favorite in the Big Ten West heading into October, is because how dominant this team was in September. But yeah, you had that 3-game losing streak, losing to Purdue, Illinois, and then getting blown out to Penn State, and that really put a big dent in their chances of winning the division. Key points, Syracuse 7-5 after starting 6-0. This team finished out the season 1-5. Gonna have to contain Mo Ibrahim. That's gonna be the biggest priority for this defense, is containing him, because he is far and away the biggest threat on this Minnesota offense. Something to keep in mind as well for Syracuse, Sean Tucker has declared for the NFL draft. He has had a great season for Syracuse, running back, over 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns. He's had a huge impact on this team. He is not going to be playing in this game, so that's going to be a difficult loss for Syracuse. They're not going to have a very strong backfield here without Sean Tucker, even though you could say Syracuse has maybe a bit more depth in the backfield in comparison to Minnesota, who just relies on Ibrahim constantly. But for Minnesota, the Gophers have played well down the stretch. Mo Ibrahim continues to excel, and defensively, one of the top teams in the country, only allowing 13 points a game. Something to keep in mind. Both teams are averaging right around 28 points a game, but defensively, Minnesota is allowing 8 less points than Syracuse on average, so something to keep in mind. But that said, let's get to the prediction here for Syracuse and Minnesota coming up here in the Pinstripe Bowl. This one, intriguing matchup, but in the end, I just got to go with the better team here, and that is going to be Minnesota. 24-17, going with the Gophers here, especially with Sean Tucker being gone for Syracuse. I mean, I just don't think Syracuse is going to be able to put up a whole lot of points. I've got them putting up 17, but I just feel like in the end, Minnesota and Ibrahim, I could see him rushing for a couple of touchdowns here. Minnesota, they get the win 24-17. So I do have Syracuse covering the spread, which is currently 10 points towards the Gophers. I do have Syracuse being competitive, but I see this being a defensive, low-scoring football game. I mean, you got two teams that haven't been terribly good on offense this season. It makes perfect sense for this to be more of a lower scoring game. So I'm going to go with Minnesota 24-17. I'm taking the under in Syracuse to cover the spread in the end, but I do want to go with Minnesota 60% or so. I think the Gophers are simply the better team here. I mean, once again, if you look at how both teams have played down the stretch, Syracuse did win their last game, but they've lost 5 of their last 6. Just haven't been the same team that we saw in the first half of the season. And Minnesota on the other side has played pretty well down the stretch, and they're playing their best football of the season, you could say, right now. But anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below on this matchup, and I appreciate you guys watching as always. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central. Catch you on the next one.